Good afternoon and welcome to the Bellingham City Council committee meetings, continuing this afternoon with Committee of the Whole. I just wanted to report that we do have a quorum present for Committee of the Whole. We have a couple of council members who are not yet present, but I expect them to join us shortly, but we're going to get started because we have a busy afternoon. So the first item before us is Agenda Bill 23003. This is an ordinance amending the 2021-2022 biennial budget, increasing revenues and expenditures for American Rescue Plan Act funding. So the attached ordinance in the packet will add revenues of $10,463,000 and expenditures of $3,250,000 to account for federal funding related to the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA. The federal government has allocated approximately $21 million to the city of Bellingham from the local fiscal recovery funds portion of ARPA. The funds will be dispersed in two tranches of about $10.5 million. We expect the first in coming weeks and the second 365 days later. The attached memo includes an overview of the city's goals for ARPA funding and several recommendations for immediate programming. And for this, I'm going to turn to our Deputy Finance Director, Forrest Longman.
Thank you, and good afternoon, council members. And so as was stated in the agenda bill, the city will receive about $21 million from the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, in two payments, the first of which will be about $10.5 million, which we have applied for and expect to receive in the coming days or weeks. So this ordinance will recognize that first payment of $10.5 million in revenue and then appropriate $3.25 million of that towards some immediate needs. The ARPA funds can be used in four broad categories: support for urgent COVID-19 response efforts, replacing lost revenue for governments to support public services, 3, support and immediate economic stabilization for households and businesses, and 4th, addressing systemic public health and economic challenges that have contributed to the unequal impact of the pandemic. Obviously, this is federal funding. There are lots of constraints and details associated with that, but that's the broad strokes. On May 24th, staff brought a memo that outlined 3 priority areas for the city to use this funding. And that was first, to focus on people first, to minimize the impact of the pandemic on our community. Second was backfilling city revenues. And third was investing in capital projects. We're trying to take a relatively measured approach to programming all of this money because we want to be thoughtful first about how we take advantage of this opportunity, but also because various additional state and federal funding sources are still being ramped up and identified. And we want to make sure that we're taking full advantage of all the potential funding sources. However, there were a number of critical areas of need that the administration is requesting appropriations for. The first of these, in the area of housing security, we're requesting $300,000 for continuation of case management and motel stays for families and children through the end of October. During that time, staff will work with county staff to develop a longer-term strategy. Second is $1.375 million to support the completion of construction of affordable housing at Samish Commons, which is the former Aloha Motel site. This project is at risk of losing a very large portion of its funding if it doesn't secure this final piece before the end of July. So by appropriating this money now, we're putting in a position where we can fund the final piece and make sure that that project happens in completion. Towards economic recovery, also associated with the Samish Commons project, is $750,000 towards the child care facility there to finish out that part of this project. And then $850,000 for tourism-related grants to reinvigorate our local tourism economy. And this $850,000 represents the funding that was lost for that purpose last year, as our hospitality industry obviously was heavily impacted by COVID-19. So staff will continue identifying the needs and funding opportunities and will bring further recommendations in coming months, but this is just the first step. And we're working with our partners at the county to make sure that as a region, we're making the best choices we can. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and I believe Tara is here that can answer any more detailed questions about some of that programming as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Longman. Any questions from council? I believe that Mr. Longman too is here before us with the ordinance, which was included in the packet.
So move.
Second.
So a motion's been made for approval by Councilmember Knudsen and a second by Councilmember Huffman. Any further or any discussion or questions? Okay, seeing none, all in favor will say aye.
Hannah, both Lisa and I have had our hand up for a bit.
They do, like your electronic hand or your physical hand? I don't see them.
Okay.
So that's a problem, but thank you for bringing that to my attention and I apologize. So I will ping IT if there's anything we can do on our end. Otherwise, I will respectfully request that council members use your physical hand so I can see you. Do you know who was first? Was that
Lisa.
Okay, Councilmember Anderson and then Vargas.
Thank you very much for recognition. And thank you, Councilmember Vargas, for jumping in there. Just to note, Hannah, I see the hands on my screen when they're up, so I'm not too sure why it's not on your end. But I was going to move approval, but I also wanted to make a comment that I fully support where the first round of some of these dollars are going. We really do need to support and backfill some of that funding for tourism. They've been really heavily hit and our economy locally really depends upon it. And I'm really happy to see that we are providing that financial piece to the Samish Commons. I know because of the phasing of way the construction is going, a major part of their funding mechanism wouldn't come in because they have to build during phase 2 some of the infrastructure for phase 3. And so it was really a tightrope that they were looking at funding from multiple sources to try to troubleshoot that issue. So I'm really happy to see that we're coming in to provide that support. And also childcare, taking a look at their plans and that first floor commercial, some of the work that they're going to be doing there, I think is just an incredible contribution to working families, especially creating that kind of childcare in the urban village. I think it kind of shows that we're walking the walk on what we say is important to our community and helping the funding. So I full-heartedly support where this funding is going. So I really appreciate staff pulling this together. Councilmember Vargas.
Thank you, Council President. I'm fully supportive of all this. I just have some questions around the 1.3 million in order to support the Samish Ways for funding. Where was that funding supposed to come from? Was that from the developer? Are we filling in a gap? I'm not clear what, so did they not complete it and we're doing this? Are we getting some money back? Can that be unpacked just a little bit, please?
Sure. So the city is still funding with the passage of our action plan that council just passed a few weeks ago. We're still funding Samish Commons at the same level, utilizing the housing levy. What happened is there's a lot of factors at play right now. Cost of construction's increased. The type of development that they're building here is a little more expensive than others because it's structured parking and it's one of the most dense developments that it is the most dense development we've seen for affordable housing. They applied for Housing Trust Fund. This is kind of the crux of the issue. If you recall the Housing Authority's strategy here, we've got over 150 units or so. They wanted a mix of housing types. And so phase 3 has some 60% of area median, and other parts of this project and other phases are targeting lower income, extremely low income. And they wanted to make sure they had a mix. Challenge is that the higher up you get on income, like in that 60% range of AMI, it's not as competitive at the state level. So they did not receive housing trust fund dollars. This is typically when we're partnering on these projects, we've got tax credits Housing Trust Fund, City of Bellingham, all coming into play to make these projects happen. What you're not seeing here is Whatcom County has been asked to help fill part of this gap too. And they are coming forward with either some funding from 1406 or ARPA. That's up to their council. That decision will be forthcoming. And then the EDI board also approved some money for the infrastructure associated with Samish Commons. So the gap was well over $3 million. And what you're seeing is a partnership between the city and the county to fill that gap. But it is a true gap associated with no housing trust fund dollars, increased cost of construction. Does that help, Pinky?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Other questions or discussion from council? Okay, we'll take a moment because I saw a hand and I was able to put it down on Lisa. So we're going to take a moment. We all test raising your hand. We're going to do a little clinic on Zoom just to see if it's okay. Perfect. All right. We're in business. Thank you for that. Okay. So any further questions or discussion? Okay. So seeing none, we had a motion for approval by Councilmember Knudsen and a second by Councilmember Huffman. All in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed or abstentions? Seeing none, we have everyone present now as well. So it passes 7-0. The second item before us is Agenda Bill 23032. This is an ordinance creating a new fund to account for the sales and use tax for housing and related services and amending the 2021-2022 biennial budget. So the attached ordinance will establish a new fund for the affordable housing sales tax, add revenues and expenditures for that fund, and add 1.0 FTE contract specialist to support new programming. In March, the City Council voted to authorize a 0.1% sales and use tax for housing and related services. The State Department of Revenue will begin collecting the tax on July 1. The city will begin receiving revenue from it in September, and the ordinance names the new fund the Affordable Housing Sales Tax Fund and budgets $3 million of expenditures against approximately $4.5 million in revenues over the biennium. This ordinance also removes estimated revenues related to this tax that were added to the low-income housing fund in a previous ordinance. The expenditure budget in that fund was not changed by the previous ordinance and remains unchanged. And so for this item, we'll also turn to Deputy Finance Director Forrest Longman.
Thank you. And I'm not sure I have much to add besides that agenda, what the agenda bill covered. I will say just that, reiterate that change to the low-income housing fund has no impact on the operations that were planned in that fund or anything along those lines. We didn't appropriate against the revenue. This is just mostly a technical change for being able to track the money a bit better. And again, this is the funding that we've been referring to as the 1590 tax. And technically is the sales and use tax for housing and related services. And we'll be naming the fund the Affordable Housing Sales Tax Fund to differentiate it from our low income housing fund. Happy to answer any questions about it.
Councilor, are there questions?
Move approval. Second.
So motion's been made for approval by Councilmember Hamel and a second by Councilmember Lilliquist. Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. If you don't have the answer in front of you, and you can direct me to the information, I'd appreciate it. As far as the contractual community development services for the 2.76 million, I'm wondering what is that covering? I know we have a lot of money that we're allocating to various low income, and this tax being new, I'm just trying to identify what specific projects is that $3 million going towards.
Yeah.
Ask Samia. Oh, would you mind, Forrest, if we have Samia turn on her screen?
I'm going to ask Samia to answer that question.
I'd be happy to. So when council reviewed the action plan, it contains specific programmed items for this fund. that cover our action plan year, which begins July 1st and goes through June 30th of next year. And that's why only $3 million of it is explicitly programmed, because that's what was covered in the action plan. And even so, of that, some of it was sort of put in a reserve on hold because we didn't have explicit projects to put it towards. So we have some allocated to services that will go along with Lydia Place's Hard House development when that opens. And then some of it allocated to actual construction of a couple of projects that would be eligible, like the Opportunity Council's Laurel and Forest project that is for seniors.
I appreciate that. I knew we had various pots of money and we had projects, and now with this new money, I was kind of wondering what was being divided out specifically to fall under these funds, and it wasn't put in there just the total dollar amount. So thank you for that information.
Councilmember Hamel.
Yeah, I just wanted to let council know that I misspoke a couple of meetings back in terms of the timing collection on this. This page 150 is absolutely correct. It's the first revenues in September, and then it kind of lays out what the expectations are for this year and then going into next year. So I apologize. I misspoke 2 meetings ago about this. So this is correct.
Thank you for that. Any further discussion or questions from council? Seeing none, we have a motion for approval of the ordinance that was made by Councilmember Hamel and seconded by Councilmember Lillquist. All in favor will say aye.
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 Any opposed or abstentions? Seeing none, that passes 7-0. So the third item before us this afternoon is Agenda Bill 23033. This is consideration of proposals to amend the city charter signature requirements for ballot initiatives and charter amendments by the petition method. Community members have requested that City Council sponsor amendments to the city charter that would lower the required number of signatures for ballot initiatives and charter amendments by the petition method. If City Council sponsors these charter amendments, they would appear on the ballot for the November general election. And for this item, I'm first going to turn to City Attorney Alan Mariner.
Hey, good afternoon. I would just add a couple of additional points. If City Council decides to initiate either of these proposed charter amendments, legal would draft the resolution necessary to initiate the charter amendment and to seek ratification from the voters in the November election. I would point out that on last Friday, we received an email from the Whatcom County auditor expressing concerns over the 20-day extension of time given if the signature gathers are short on signatures. That's in both our existing charter for ballot initiatives, but also in the language proposed by these residents for the proposed changes for other charter amendments. So we probably would want to think about that language because that just doesn't work for the deadlines that the county has for getting matters onto the ballot. The other thing two other things. City Council should remember that residents of the city could propose either of these charter amendments through the petition method. And in fact, residents are currently seeking to change the number of signatures required for ballot initiatives that they're gathering signatures as we speak. I think, let me just see here. I don't know if James Erb is on. He is not. I don't see him. Okay, that's all I have. James, if he signs in, he's our expert.
He's on the call, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, all right, James. If you have anything else to add, if you do so at this time.
Thank you, Alan. Good afternoon, Council. I think you did a great job summarizing where we're at. If the Council does desire to move forward, we would need to pass a resolution before primary day because that is the auditor's deadline for getting anything on the ballot for November. And everything else I think was adequately summarized by Mr. Mariner. So unless anyone has questions for me, I will sign back off.
Thank you, Mr. Erb. Councilmember Lillquist and then Huffman.
Yeah, I'd like to make a motion that we ask staff to prepare the appropriate resolutions and any changes that needed to be made to the text to prepare for a vote to put these on the ballot in November. And then if that's seconded, I think we should circle back to the other issue that Mr. Mariner raised about the auditor's concerns.
Second. I second it. Tie goes to Jean.
It was definitely seconded multiple times. Yeah, I was going to say second to goes to Jean Knudsen. Okay, Councilmember Huffman.
Yeah, I'm just curious if these require a public hearing.
James, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not think that they do require a public hearing. They would require ratification by the voters in November. So the city would be saying, city council would be saying, this is what we think should happen. Voters, will you ratify so we can amend our charter?
And may I follow up briefly with that? And just to say that in our charter, the publication is not by hearing, but rather we would have to publish notice of the proposed charter amendments in the city's official newspaper for at least 4 successive weeks before the voters have the opportunity to vote on them. There's certainly, while not a requirement for a public hearing, Councilmember Huffman, there's nothing that prohibits the city council from scheduling a public hearing on this matter.
Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say that I fully support this. I know in Washington State, we've had some really bad initiatives. We all know under who, but the good thing about this is that this would not impact our budgets, our personnel decisions, voter passed levies. It's not to repeal it. So I just strongly feel that there's kind of a false bar tying the percentage to the governor's count for those election years versus more local. And we should try to look at opportunities that would allow citizen initiative, citizen voice, and ultimately it's the democracy of our process to allow the community to weigh in whether or not they think these initiatives are good or not. So I don't want to necessarily be responsible for gatekeeping on citizen initiatives. So I think it's a fair percentage to look at both of these. And I fully support something being written and brought back to us. One thing that I would suggest is if we're looking at the 2 options based on what came from the auditors, I think they had stated maybe move it back so that it could be sent forward and then get the 20-day. I spoke with a couple of people and they would like to keep the date and then perhaps drop the 20-day, like the secondary review, because with a lower number, and if they do what is suggested to target 10 or 15% above that number to handle any attrition of bad signatures, there shouldn't be a reason for it to have to come back again for that 20 days. So I would lean more that direction, keeping the maximum time for the filing and then maybe drop the 20-day, but perhaps give that as an option to us for one or the other for a vote. Thank you.
Councilmember Vargas.
Thank you. I'm in support of this. I'm just kind of curious. Does this make us the same as the state? And I'm curious whether or not we have any concerns from the city on changing this. Just curious.
Well, I would say there are 2 different charter amendment proposals. One is with regards to the required number of signatures for charter amendments, that's changing, going away from what the state would require under the RCWs to, it's keeping the same 15% of total number of votes cast, but under the RCW, it's based on the last preceding general election, so it's going to be a bigger number. The proposed change is 15% of the total number of votes cast for the office of mayor at the last preceding municipal general election. So it's going to be 15% of a smaller number. So for that proposal, we're going away from what the state is saying and adopting it'll require a smaller number of total signatures. The other one, as far as reducing the number of signatures for the ballot initiatives, is reducing it from 20% to 8% of the total number of votes cast for the office of mayor. So it's a local change. It's just saying we're going to require less signatures. James, do you have anything to add to that?
Councilmember Lillquist.
Yeah, I do support these changes. And one of the reasons is that they're really best viewed together. Charter amendments is an appropriate percentage of signatures, but it was benchmarked to a statewide vote rather than a city-specific vote that indicates the size of the voter population, typically in city issues. So that's just a matter of the proper benchmark. But right now, the direct ordinances are at a much higher signature number than charter amendments, which I think is kind of backwards. Regular direct ordinances are, in a certain sense, less consequential than a charter amendment, which changes the constitution of city government itself. So in my mind, it's really appropriate to drop that down to 8%, which is more in line with what's done in other cities and in the state. So I just think these are practical, good government reforms. The only concern I've really heard about these is that it makes it easier for bad initiatives to get on the ballot as well as good ones. I don't think we should try to stop that. I think that the decision about whether or not a proposal is bad or good goes to the voters. That's kind of the whole point behind this. So the city council will have an opportunity, if an initiative comes forward that is clearly flawed in some way, of proposing an alternative so that we could, in a certain sense, put forward the initial idea supported by petitioners and see if the public likes it, but remove any particular problems that might be kind of fatal. There are some initiatives going around right now, and I think there's a couple of things in there that we just can't do by ordinance, and we can simply remove those and we can fix the initiatives. And in a certain sense, ensure a higher quality of decision for the voters during the election. So I support these, and I do want them moving forward to the voters to see if they agree.
Thank you. And my apology, Councilmember Hamel, that I didn't recognize you before allowing Councilmember Lillquist to speak again, but you are up now, Councilmember Hamel.
Thank you. So I have a real hard time with this. I think we're going into waters that I don't know that have been completely explored. When we lower the bar for one group, we lower the bar for every group. The first initiative that was created by the person that Councilmember Anderson referred to as the WHO, who shall remain nameless, was I-200. That was a direct attack on affirmative action. There were dozens of other initiatives that were created by that person and in that group. I think that the state number is too low. I think it should be, I think Bellingham has the right number. We've all been, if you've read the paper, you know that Bellingham School District employees and board members were attacked. There was a book that was read about a trans kid in one of the classrooms, and people went after that. We hear a lot about critical race theory right now. The mayor, myself, and Councilmember Huffman all serve on the Racial Equity Commission Development Board. I don't want to see good work being undone through an initiative process. And it's not just if something like that were to pass, it's the process of the attacks that could happen to BIPOC people or trans kids in this case. I mean, in the case of what just happened in the school district. So I'm not supportive of this. I don't think it should. I think if you have a good idea, then you can get the signatures. But lowering the bar for one lowers for everybody. And I'm afraid that bad actors might use this and weaponize it in a way that's going to be attacking marginalized people.
Councilmember Knudsen lowered your hand.
Yeah, I'm playing with it here. I'm about done with Zoom anyway. So anyway, I'm sorry. I understand where Dan is coming from, but I've had a lot of conversations over the last few weeks by a lot of people who really support this. You know, there's been times in the past when, as Michael said, he I don't know if he was here in time, we had quite a few initiatives come forward, and a lot of times, not a lot of times, but a few times the council said no, and we did other things, and that's the way it works. If something so ludicrous and ridiculous comes forward, it's something that we can take action on. But no, I agree that there are some things that people worry about. I have enough battle scars over the initiative process to show, and it's been tough at times, but a lot of people, you know, work very hard to get these signatures, and so I'm going to go ahead and support it.
Councilmember Huffman.
Thank you. Excuse me. So I definitely, you know, I'm looking through these two items, share some of the concerns that Dan has, particularly when it comes to citizens initiatives being used against marginalized communities, and that even if those initiatives don't pass, there is still harm that's done. And so that is one of my reservations. And so I think more information about how we avoid that, or, I mean, it's not going to be entirely avoided, but the checks to make sure that we don't become an area where something like that has happened, because there are areas where we're making great progress, and to have distractions or to have people who want to harm that progress, it is a concern for me too. So I would be interested in hearing a little bit more, maybe from legal, about the restrictions on the citizens initiative process as is being presented here, like what can't be done. As far as I understand, taxes are off the table. So he who should not be named won't be coming at us with that, at least. But what else is not allowed? What are the checks? How do we, I guess, what are the checks so that we can be sure that, in particular, marginalized communities aren't harmed?
So, Councilman Huffman, I would prefer to we're going to need to spend a little time coming up with that, and I would propose to bring back those restrictions and checks on maybe what initiatives that may come forward that council thinks are inappropriate. I would present that. I would propose to present that when we present the resolutions for consideration.
Councilmember, Mr.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify something. I thought I heard a misstatement earlier from Councilmember Lillquist with respect to the numbers and the percentages, that right now the percentage for a charter amendment is greater than the percentage for an initiative. And while that is true, when we're talking about just the denominator, the number, the percentage, we're talking about different numerators here. And I want to flesh that out a little bit. So in the last mayoral election in 2019, there were approximately 31,000 votes cast within the city. 20% of that number is, give or less, 6,200 people. Okay, and that's the number of signatures that you would need today to put an initiative on the ballot in Bellingham. This would lower that number from 6,200 to 2,500. So back to Councilmember Hamel and Councilmember Huffman's points, when you think about the types of divisive issues that could be brought forward in Bellingham, you're not talking about things that need broad public support. You're talking about issues that only need 2,500 people to agree with them to get them on the ballot. And following up, the city attorney's office, we provide no legal or technical advice to initiative sponsors when they come forward with initiatives in Bellingham. We don't provide any advice. There's no method for us to do that. With respect to the numbers, again, state law currently requires 15% of the number of votes cast in the last preceding state general election within the municipality to make a charter amendment. And I do echo the point that was made earlier that charter amendments should be difficult because that is the organic law of the city. We do want that to be a higher threshold. So right now, that threshold is 8,200 people. you need 8,200 voters to sign a charter petition to change the city's charter. And that's a high number, and it should be. The initiative to lower or to change that threshold would be to make it 15% of the number cast for mayor last time. That makes it about 4,600. So it drops from 8,200 to 4,600 to amend our charter, which is, less than what you would need currently for a ballot initiative. So I just wanted to put some actual numbers around what we're talking about, because when we just say 15, 8, 20%, it might be hard to wrap your head around that. But when you realize you're talking about lowering the threshold for initiatives to 2,500 people, that's not a significant number in a city of our size.
I could just interject briefly and ask a follow-up question or ask for legal feedback as well. I know that, I believe it was Councilmember Anderson, but in a comment about the fact that these changes it's at no cost to the city or our staff, and that it's turned over to the public. But my understanding is that when initiatives are brought forward, if you obtain the number of signatures, that those are brought to the city, and then there is a strict timeline, my understanding is, for a response, which obviously then puts that to the top of the priority or workload list for our legal. Is that correct, or can you address that process?
That is correct. We do have a very carefully delineated process in the municipal code for how we're supposed to respond to these things. And it does push things up the queue to be dealt with immediately. And then furthermore, once we get through the ballot title writing process, right, we let the county auditor know that, and they publish notice, the initiative sponsors can go out and collect signatures. And this is really an appropriate time to talk about this. Friday is the deadline for the 4 initiatives that are currently being circulated across the city. For those proponents to bring forward their signatures to say we have enough signatures. Once those are delivered to the city, they'll be given to the county auditor for verification of the sufficiency of those signatures. And if they're enough, we will know the last week of July that they're enough, which means if there are enough signatures, we will have to add 1 to 4 items to the council's agenda for the first week in August to decide whether to adopt the proposal, to defer it to the voters, to take no action, or to propose another initiative dealing with the same subject so that voters could consider both of those at the same time. And council will have 1 meeting to do it because the calendar is so compressed. And that's without addressing the issue of the 20-day grace period that's in our code that the county auditor has represented she cannot do. So if the initial verification shows that the initiative sponsors have come up short, it's very possible that it will not reach the ballot, even if they're able to go out and secure a few additional signatures as needed.
Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Erb, for covering some of those numbers. I had those ready to kind of illustrate. Just to speak a little bit to Councilmember Hamill's concerns, I also have those concerns because there could be some bad initiatives that come forward that could really create division in the community. But if there are any that are really racially charged, biased, and the thought that there would be 2,500 signatures supporting something like that, I think as a community, that has value in itself, because that means if someone is putting something forward that really is marginalizing or impacting community members in such a way, like our transgender, then I think there's a lot of work we need to do as a community and perhaps in city leadership in order to address the underlying factors of what's happening. So in some ways, these bias, we know they exist, but if they exist in such numbers that they could gain that type of support to get an initiative going, I would kind of want to have that lid taken off and opened to be able to examine that as a community, because there's a lot that we need to be working towards to try to amend and deal with that. And I would imagine if something like that came out on ballot, that would probably bring out a lot of people to vote it down as a community, which is also having a great support to show where our values are. And then to Councilmember Hathman, there was a document, and I can send it to you, speaking specifically to basically no ordinance shall be initiated related to the annual budget, capital expense budget, making, repealing any appropriation, fixing the salaries or wages of officers or employees, or authorizing the repealing of levy and taxes. So those are a few things that would not be impacted. But also when the city legal is looking at this, you have a valid point when it comes to timing and staffing, that if this does open it up, that we see more initiatives, then when you're looking at the timing of submission and the process, we also need to take into consideration what can our facilitate. So if we were to get 4 every election cycle, what does that workload look like for you? And do we have enough time the way it's put in? So I would really like to see your advice on where your needs would be in the worst case and maybe best case scenario on workload. Because if we need to move it a little bit to give more time to be able to get it through the process so that we do have time to amend it, draft it, get it in front of the voters, that's essential too. We can't expect our legal department to become super people on the election cycle if something happened like we had 5 or 6. So I'd like that to be part of our consideration.
Councilmember Lillquist.
Thank you. First of all, I'm hearing some good and sincere debate and some reasonable concerns being raised. And I guess I would just say there will be a time to make those arguments, and that will be before November. If we do put this on the ballot, the public will be able to weigh the concerns that Mr. Hamill raised or anybody else raises about changing these signature gathering requirements. I would like to do kind of a straw poll of the council on 2 of the issues. One has to do with the extension period, which was raised as a concern by the county official. I think we should get rid of the extension period. I think it's clearly troublesome and problematic, unworkable on the county. And I think it's no longer needed if we're reducing the threshold number. We've no longer set such a high bar. We need to give them a second chance to get over it. We can set another bar and give them 1 chance to get over it. The other thing I want to poll people on is the 8% threshold. As the people who brought this forward suggested, we could pick another number. For example, Seattle uses 10%. And that might go some way towards creating a balancing act. Lowering the number of signatures from where it currently stands for initiatives from 6,200, maybe not as low as 2,500, but something more like what I'm looking at is more like 3,100. That maybe Mr. Hamill, you'd find that 10% isn't quite as bad. So that's my straw poll. How would the council feel about eliminating the extension period and bringing forward a 10% number in the ordinance or the resolution that staff would be preparing?
Point of order. Can I suggest that you bifurcate those, Michael?
Sure, and probably a good idea. Thank you.
And we have a motion before us as well.
Well, I could propose these as amendments, but I don't want to go. Let me just go ahead and do that, and then you can feel free to vote against it. I would also amend the motion that the extension period currently allowed for would be eliminated in the new proposal.
Second.
So that motion was made, or amendment made by Councilmember Lillquist, seconded by Councilmember Knudsen. All in favor would say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed?
No.
Any abstentions? Seeing none, that passes 6-1. Councilmember Lillquist.
I would make a further motion to amend the motion, the current main motion, to make it a 10% number for the initiative process rather than the 8%.
Okay.
Amendment proposed by Councilmember Lillquist and a second by Councilmember Knutson. All in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed?
No.
Any abstentions? Seeing none, that passes 6-1. And so the motion before us is for legal to review this and bring it back, or
Prepare the ordinance necessary to put it on the ballot.
Councilmember Vargas.
Thank you. I'm wondering if legal could also, when you come back with us, take a look at some of the parameters around signature gathering, that no paid, that it all be, because I know sometimes when you pay people to get signatures, they're not always forthright about what sometimes, and so we've seen some of that go wrong in our state, and I'm curious if you could let us know what our parameters are going to be around around signature gathering, and if we have any rules and regulations that can help control that.
Councilmember Huffman.
Thank you. To add to the things to bring back, next time we discuss this, I think, Lisa mentioned, Councilmember Anderson mentioned some of the guidelines of no ordinance shall be initiated relating to the annual budget or capital expense budget, making or repealing any appropriation, fixing the salaries of or wages of officers or employees, or authorizing or repealing the levy of taxes. I'd be interested in digging a little deeper into the interpretation of some of those. For example, no ordinance shall be initiated relating to the annual budget. Sounds pretty all-encompassing. I don't know if we make a lot of decisions, and rarely do they not relate to the budget. And so I guess getting a little bit more of a definition of what that would mean would be really helpful. And I think also what would be really helpful is sharing with all of us and sharing with the public some more concrete numbers, examples that aren't just percentages. Just, what would this have meant this year, for example, for initiatives, and the number of signatures needed, with the different, as it is now versus as it would be if we were to pass these, or if the voters were to vote to approve these. So for next time, thank you.
Further discussion from council? Seeing none, we have the main motion still on the table that was brought forward by Councilmember Lillquist and seconded by Councilmember Knutson. All in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? I believe Councilmember Hamel stepped away for a moment.
Counted as absent.
Sorry.
No
Gotta grab coffee.
No worries. So on that vote, I just wanted to acknowledge your vote. So this is on the final motion presented by Councilmember Lillquist and seconded by Councilmember Knutson. Is that a no?
That's a no.
And so that passes 6-1. And to members of legal, do you have what you need to come back? Anything further?
I think so. I think we're on a fairly short timeline here, so we have some work to do. But I think we have direction.
Okay. Thank you. So the next item then before us this afternoon is Agenda Bill 23015. This is discussion of options for civil oversight of law enforcement in Bellingham. Concern about lack of effective oversight of police, particularly in instances of use of force, has driven demand for the creation of additional oversight mechanisms. Civilian boards to oversee certain aspects of police activity or increase police accountability have been adopted in approximately 150 cities. According to the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, Nicole, During this session, council will receive a briefing on other cities with civilian oversight with a focus on the audit and review oversight models. And for this item, I believe we're going to turn to our legislative analyst, Mark Gardner, to get us started.
Good afternoon, Council. I have in the packet for you a memo that reviews 9 different oversight agencies. My understanding is that, excuse me, too much hiking in hot weather yesterday. My understanding was you wanted a review of a range of different oversight agencies to get a sense of what they do, what they cover, how the functions vary according to cities. And I do have a PowerPoint, if I could put that up for you. And can you see a PowerPoint presentation? Okay, great. I'm going to go through this now. And so in the memo and in this PowerPoint, I've reviewed some information from 9 different cities. I can't say it's a representative sample. There's probably close to 200 cities that have these agencies. And so it's difficult to decide how to do that. But what I did is I used the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement website, and I just did a kind of a cross-reference with population size. I left in a couple larger cities just for reference purposes. And I looked at cities that were somewhere around the population of Bellingham, give or take, some range. So basically, I focused in mostly on oversight boards that relate to cities with populations from 60,000 to 120,000. Most of these incorporate a review function, and some have an audit function as well, such as reviewing police department policies and practices. The descriptions of boards are drawn from official documents with little editing. I didn't attempt to rewrite in any fancy way the language that they use to describe their own operations, because I figured that they're the best they're the best authorities for describing what they do. So whenever I could, I pulled those directly from official documents with just a small amount of editing. And an important point to note is that a number of cities have additional oversight entities, usually an Office of Civilian Review. And I do note that the presence of these, the exact way they interact with the boards and with any internal functioning investigation process in the police department itself, that's a kind of a different project, requires a lot more in-depth analysis, but I did want to note that there's often more than one piece to civilian oversight, and I also went through the last. Mostly, I tried to focus on 2021. That occasionally I had to go back into late 2020 to get a sense of what these boards were doing with their time. So, just a few other points of comparison. The size of these boards ranges from 5 to 11. I'm guessing that probably covers most boards in the country. It's hard to imagine too many that would be smaller than 5, and over 11 gets rather unwieldy. Staff size ranged from 1 to 7, but this information I don't think is extremely useful, because without understanding exactly what those staff do, it just gives you a sense of how different cities decide to put resources into these, the overall oversight operation compared to one another. The year of formation of these oversight boards ranged widely from 1973 to 2020. And the meeting frequency is also quite varied, ranging from twice per month to quarterly, with monthly meetings most common. And now I just wanted to go briefly over some of these to give you a sense of what they do and how they conceive of their work. So Albany, New York, which is about the same size as Bellingham, has a review and audit function oversight board that meets monthly, has 9 members, and some of the recent topics are to review the complaints against the Albany police. That's not surprising given that they're a review board. They also discussed how to provide public access to contracts for surveillance technology. They discuss collection of data on traffic stops, including the racial and gender composition of those stops, and whether or not the board should have independent disciplinary power. Just as an interesting aside, this particular review board has staffing from a local law school, which is unfortunately an option we would not have available locally. So Berkeley is really the oldest one of the ones I've looked at. It's been around since 1973. They have a police review commission, but that is currently in the process of being replaced by a new police accountability board. This was via a charter amendment. It does review and audit, but it has at least some investigative functions. They can dig deeper, and they have some subpoena power. This is with the new board, and they can retain their own counsel, et cetera. As an example of the kind of things that their oversight boards, now plural, have been looking at recently. One example is discussion of recommendations on no-knock warrants. Another is discussion of hate crimes tracking in Berkeley and the response to recent anti-Asian hate crimes. Discussion of findings of the city's reimagining public safety task force. The city of Berkeley had a separate time-limited task force to dig into kind of structural policy questions that they wanted the city to be able to respond to. And their ongoing citizen review boards spend a lot of time reviewing the police policy documents in Lexipol and suggesting changes to that. Boulder, Colorado, highlighted the year because it's brand new. It's the police oversight panel. It is review and audit is basically what it does. Boulder's a little bit larger than Bellingham. Some recent topics they've covered are a briefing on the development of the new conflict resolution mediation program. Some cities have various forms of mediation built into their oversight and review. Not surprisingly and tragically, there was quite a bit of time set aside to discuss the shooting at the King Soopers Market, which resulted in 10 deaths. And because they're new, they spent a lot of time discussing the criteria for case selection. And they decided the important areas are use of force, bias or profiling, failure to provide service, complaints involving juveniles or minors, and allegation of crimes by an officer. Moving on, Corvallis. This is a smaller city, a little less than 60,000. They have a community police review oversight board. This was the purest example I saw of a review-only board. They only meet quarterly, and some of the topics that they covered recently are a review of officer-involved shootings and a review of internal affairs and commendation reports. Davis, California, also pretty new, founded in 2019. Davis is a little bit smaller than Bellingham. They have a police accountability commission. It incorporates the review and audit functions. In terms of their areas of activity recently, they include a briefing on the 9/11 dispatch process with a focus on mental health related calls, a briefing on the city response to homelessness, an update by the auditor on investigations, which is one element that they have of oversight that, in addition to the board, and they also regarding investigations. So they asked the auditor to report on ongoing investigations and the auditor's review of the 8 Can't Wait policy review. They also discussed board research on local mental health response services and training. Iowa City Community Police Review Board. They also are review and audit. I did highlight this one point about one public forum per year. A number of these boards have regular meetings, but they also have a delineated specific number of public meetings that are also required to conduct. In terms of their recent topics, these include a review of Iowa City Police Department policies, such as response to domestic violence by officers, use or failure to use body-worn cameras, et cetera. Discussion of measures to strengthen the review powers of the board. response to the police department for demographic data on people arrested or detained, and the development of an annual budget for the board. Lastly, I looked at the Civilian Police Review Board in Urbana. This is actually the smallest city that I looked at. They have been in place since 2011. They do pretty much strictly review, and some of their topics include appeal hearings and board findings, discussions of ways to improve the review process, discussion of revision on use of force, and review of taser use by police officers. And I did find when doing these that the categorizations were not always absolutely precise. Like this one is mostly review, but they grade slightly over to what you might call an audit in terms of a broader review of what they see regarding police practices. So that's my quick overview. There's more detail in the memo, and I can answer any questions if you have any.
Okay. Mr. Gardner, could you take down the presentation just to facilitate that discussion? Questions or discussion from council? Councilmember Hamel.
So I think it's really important. I think we're getting to this place of trying to figure out what our goals are here in doing this and moving forward. And I listened to everyone's conversation last time, and I've been doing a lot of research on this topic. There's a couple of pieces. One is personally, I feel like the review board model works really well when blended a little bit with auditing board. And I think as I read it, the review would be a civilian or citizen or resident composed board, and to review use of force and other items that are police related. The audit part of it would be, what recommendations could we make to change things? There's a thing called GARE, Government Alliance for Racial Equity, and we use that in the Incarceration Prevention and Reduction Task Force. That could be something that a board like this could recommend, that we have a GARE overlay on all things that we are discussing when we're talking about policy improvements. And then the other piece I think that is important locally here, we talked about Racial Equity Commission just before I mentioned it. So there's a development team that the mayor and Councilmember Huffman and Buchanan and from the county side and staff also do the executive sit on, but there's also a work group that's coming up that should be impaneled by the end of this month. And I'd be really curious as to get their take on this work. There's also the Immigration Advisory Board. I'd be very curious as to get their take on this work. And specifically people from marginalized communities, I want them to have every opportunity to have every voice present in discussing how we do this. Not necessarily, in every decision later, but certainly in guiding our policy on this. So those kind of two big main points, I just wanted to make those.
Thank you. Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. And thank you, Mark, for pulling this together. It was exactly what we were asking, was some comparative examples to our population base. So I really appreciate it. One of the things, much like Councilmember Hamel just mentioned, part of it is like overall, what are our goals? What are we hoping to achieve? And I think we really need to sit down and identify what those are, whether it's a workshop or during, a separate session where we can say, these are the goals, because that's going to help us identify what would be the best process. I too agree with the review and audit. And some of the research I've done is kind of the pros and cons. And one of the things that I get concerned about is taking away really what the chief of police should be doing. And what the internal investigation should be doing, because sometimes when you have a board who does a lot of that, then the chief of police may not, or those assigned may not necessarily be focused on that duty. And that's the internal culture that we hope to make sure that we're always improving. So I liked the Corvallis example because it was where there's the internal investigation to complaints. And if somebody was not satisfied, they kind of file an appeal on certain types of complaints, and then those the board could really review. So anything outside of, maybe it's the use of force, maybe it's the, police involved shooting, whatever the criteria is that we identify. I also like the second tier of being able to have a place to file an appeal should you file a complaint. And ultimately, for me, the goal would be just to improve our practices. So there's a little bit of that audit component where we can find trends of where there might be internal bias or where we could improve practices. So I kind of lean towards that example of review with a little bit of the audit. But also, I'd really like for us to identify what our goals are for establishing this. And ultimately, we'll have to determine budget and staffing for support. That's going to have to come along with this. And then sometimes, I think of us on council, we have 2 support people for 7 of us. So one is kind of our support assistant, and then we have Mark, who is really our kind of research and liaison for that. And I mean, looking at some of these other programs where, they have their own legal counsel for this board, and city council doesn't even have that. So not to say that we shouldn't be providing staffing, but also want to make sure that we create something that is going to be very useful, meet those goals, but also is fiscally realistic for the work that's going to be accomplished. Whether it's a full-time staff member, if it's utilizing staff we have, whether it's increasing staffing to city council in a shared position where, someone's with the board, and then increasing some of our support. That's a whole nother conversation later, because there are times that I could really use staffing to do some work, and we don't have that for council. So that's a broader conversation in the future, but just a few thoughts.
Councilmember Lillquist.
Thank you. So I also want to thank Mark for bringing this forward and showing us some specifics. We've talked about it generally speaking, but I think we need some specific examples to kind of have something for us to react to and for people to know what we're talking about. In terms of our goals, I think our highest goals are pretty clear and not particularly new. We're looking for transparency, we're looking for trust building, we're looking for improved outcomes, we're looking for better policing. Or policing the right way in the right time. And hopefully this is a way that we can further getting there. Also, I'm still going back to what Nicole, uses, is there's no one best practice. You have to figure out what fits your community. And I agree with what Dan said. I think Lisa said it too. I'm really interested in a review model, at least to start with, right? At minimum, we need to have a review component. And then the audit component can come like next year, in year 2, or the latter half of the year. And we can build on it year after year, that audit component, which is really, stepping back and looking at policing, kind of how it works, not just at individual disciplinary acts or to see if there's a pattern or trend of some problem, but, step back and look for what we can do better. In terms of what we don't want, I think we don't want an office with paid staff and professionals, so the risk of bureaucracy and certainly the enormous expense. It's just another agency alongside a police department. I don't think we want that. And that does exist in some bigger communities, and I don't think we want that. But we do want more input from our residents. And residents who are, brought up to speed on police practices in Bellingham, and generally speaking, so they know what they're seeing. And then when they give a report to us and to the community about what they're finding, we'll know that they have taken a look and they know what they're talking about. So at first and at a minimum, I want us to have someone who can look over the shoulder of the existing complaint process and existing disciplinary outcomes. But the policy level, I'd like some help for someone to look at, for example, our use of force policy, or programs to address hate crimes, or the use of predictive policing technology, or the demographics of arrest, or the issue of traffic stops. Those are all policy issues. I think almost every single one of them has come up before this city council in the past few years. Well, it'd be nice if there was a civilian board that also looked at those policy issues along with us and could provide feedback to us and to the community. So I also want to echo what Dan said about shopping this around. We're sort of shopping it around right now. I'm hoping members of the public will give us feedback on what they're hearing, whether or not they do think we should form some kind of a civilian oversight body with the review functions at least, and maybe some audit functions. But do what Dan says. Reach out to the Racial Equity Commission stakeholder group that's being formed, and reach out to our own immigrant advisory board to hear what they're thinking. I think it's time to start shopping these ideas around. So that we can go to start talking more about what specific form of review, with a little bit of audit, we might be able to institute. And then potentially talk about the budget impacts. If we do a review model, we're going to need to staff that. It won't be much, but it'll be something. And I want to make sure that we do have staff to support those meetings and to support any kind of reports they come up with.
Thank you. Councilmember Knudsen.
Yes, I know there's a lot of ideas being floated around, but I'd like to just ask a simple question. When are we going to involve the police guild or the police department in all this? You know, we have 9 bargaining units in this town. And again, I'm going to say what I said a while back. You know, we do have a Public Works Advisory Board. We have a Parks and Rec Advisory Board. We don't hear the word oversight with those. Now, I understand why. Last year was a horrible year for everybody when what happened to Mr. Floyd in Minnesota. But again, I think a lot of the reaction, but I'll give Councilmember Lillquist his due. He's been talking about this long before that happened. So, but I know it's intensified now. But with people we have now in our police department, I think they need to be involved with this. They might have ideas too. So I think we need to, further down the line, we go over this, let's present it to them. Let's have them come forward and talk to us also, rather than them maybe feeling they're being singled out. Because if you do a oversight board, it's going to be totally different than an advisory board. We have a lot of advisory boards, but when the rubber hits the road, it's the city council who makes the decisions. So I just think at some point we need to involve the police guild and the police department.
Thank you. Councilmember Vargas.
Thank you. And Mark, yes, thank you very much for putting all this together. It was very helpful. I currently right now, I'm leaning more toward the Corvallis example. I think that we should do this incrementally. And I think starting just with a review is a great place to start. And then we have a baseline and we see what our issues are and we see where we're at and whether or not we have to intensify that, et cetera. But I think that that is a really great place for us to start. But I also agree in regards to Councilmember Hamill's comments on what are our priorities? If you look at all these different cities around what different kinds of priorities they have, I think that's an important part for us to drill down on and see what actually we want to get out of this. And we want to make sure it is worthwhile for our community and that it absolutely involves our police department. So just wanted to, that's my thoughts.
Councilmember Huffman.
So it sounds like we're all pretty similar in what our goals for this are, which is great. I think starting with just a review board would be fine. I think that that's a wonderful way to get to some accountability and trust with the community. But I also think that long-term solution and that long-term policy and data analysis is so important if we want long-term change. So I would hope that we have some kind of audit component somewhere at some point. It doesn't necessarily have to be in conjunction with an oversight board, but that element is happening somewhere. So I guess I'm curious. It sounds like we'd like to invite a lot more input into this process as well. And I'm curious what the next steps are, how we go about that, kind of who or what entity spearheads the leadership to start the process of creating this board. Do we, as a council, do that? Do we have, as representatives, start to do that? I guess curious about thoughts about how do we start taking some steps to make it happen.
Mayor Flavin.
Yeah, I might propose, in light of the range of opinions and concerns and ideas that have been expressed today, that the administration and Mr. Gardner work together to incorporate all of these thoughts into some process recommendations, perhaps including some timelines, and bring them back to you for review.
Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. And I just wanted to thank Gene, because he kind of stole some, or I should say he advanced some of the information I was thinking. I'm never for something that pits more of an adversarial or a punitive tone to anything. And I don't think that is at all our goal. Our goal is to create avenues of really good information to help us base decisions to continuously improve not only as a city and services, but our law enforcement department. And I think they've done a lot of good work. And I think of some of situations that have come up in the past where that information would never have come to light if it wasn't internal reporting that they thought they had an issue. And I want to make sure that that type of integrity is always held in place. And I also agree that we need to work with our law enforcement union, or I should say guild, and also our police leadership in order to get their ideas of how this type of community or citizen board could be advanced to help them be informed and make improvements. Because for the folks that I have talked to who are in this profession, that's their goal. And I think it's really important to hear. And it also will, I think, when you have people who work in the field and they have inside information, they're going to also be part of that illuminating where the need is and how they're going to benefit. And I don't think that, contrary to some public belief, that they're going to be roadblocks to this process. They should be partners. And I can't imagine anybody on council or in city leadership who would not believe that. So as we start formulating and moving forward, and thank you, Councilmember Huffman, as far as what is our next steps, who takes the lead on this. But when that does get formed and whoever on council is participating, I do hope that we're going to be able to have, along with our community stakeholders, to also keep in mind that our guild and our law enforcement leadership is part of that stakeholder. It's much easier and a much better product and service to come forward when we all work together and there's buy-in from everyone and a belief from everyone that this is going to make us better. And so we do need to work with our law enforcement through this process. And I think the sooner we start that, the better it will be. And we'll truly get really good buy-in because they know that they're being valued and that their voice matters in this process. And we haven't really involved them yet. And I don't want to go too much further and not start involving them in some of the conversations.
Thank you. Councilmember Hamel.
I agree. When I was listing off the names of stakeholders, that was only external. I'm sorry, I made the assumption that police would absolutely be involved with this, and they have to be. Look at the changing dynamic landscape. You've got 1310, which completely changes everything on certain types of behavioral health calls. July 25th, next month, not a year from now, next month. This is a big deal. You've got the other 12 laws that came down from Olympia, the alternate response team, 988 coming online for behavioral health next year. We have to have the expertise in the room so that we're making the appropriate decisions. So and the folks that are going to be working on this are going to have that education. Because it's not just what we had last year or 5 years ago. Everything's changing now. So I want to make sure that everyone's at the table and sharing the information together.
Your bird impression is great.
So I feel like I'm in an aviary, or however you say that word.
Thank you, Councilmember Hamel. Councilmember Lillquist.
Yeah, I do believe that our police need to be involved in this discussion. I've spoken with the former chief and the current chief, but that doesn't really substitute for creating the sort of understanding and buy-in I think we're going to need. I was talking with someone about these sort of oversights, and according to the experience of the people in the field, the make or break for these programs isn't the model you follow, and it isn't even the budget you give it. It's whether or not there's police buy-in. It's whether or not they see it as a program that's there to support better policing, or if it's something that they need to treat hostilely. I'm hoping that we can create a situation where our best allies for better policing are the police themselves. And I'm hoping that a civilian oversight is one way we can get to better policing, and that I hope that every single one of us is on board with that. Policing may change and be different, but no matter what happens, it should be something we're proud of, something that's, just. And I think that's what people swear to do when they put on the uniform. So yes, we definitely need police involvement, police buy-in, police support.
Thank you, Councilmember Lillquist. So Councilmember Huthman had asked about next steps, and Mayor Fleetwood responded. I wanted to make sure that Mr. Gardner had what he needed. I know this was on the agenda, seeking direction. So there's been lots of discussion. I just wanted to confirm if you have what you need going forward, or if there are any final thoughts from council as well.
I would say that if it's okay with the council, to move forward with the mayor's proposal to work with his staff to develop a timeline and a rollout and who will be involved. And council would then have a ability to weigh in on that and decide if additional public outreach is needed, or outreach to certain communities or whatever. So that seems reasonable to me.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, so more to come as we expected on this issue. And the next item before us this afternoon is Agenda Bill 22971. So this is a fire department strategic plan. In 2020, the fire department completed a strategic planning process. In this session, staff will present a more in-depth look at the final 6 goals in the strategic plan related to training, wellness, dispatch, emergency management, life safety, and future growth. And for this item, we're going to welcome back Fire Chief Bill Hewitt.
Yes, good afternoon, Council. Bill Hewitt from the Fire Department. And as the agenda bill says, this is the third and final installment of the strategic plan rollout here for Council. The first one was the overview. Then 2 weeks ago, we had a little more in-depth look at the first 4 of the recommendations or goals out of the plan. Today, we're going to dive into the last 6 goals there in the plan. So I'm going to start here by putting up a slideshow. And if my slides look awfully familiar, it's because I am very much using the same show over and over again, but it works well for reinforcements here. Hang on, here we go. Okay, and so just going to review real quick the process. Of course, we used an outside consultant. We did a lot of internal interviews, group discussions. We got some citizen input, and then our consultant spent a lot of time collecting data. The first 4 goals we talked about last meeting, which was stabilizing the staffing, continue our recruitment efforts, continuing to promote a culture that values diversity within the organization, and improving our EMS response. Today, we're going to be looking at the last half of the plan, which is where we talk about continue the improvements to emergency services response systems. We'll talk about how we improve the capabilities of our life safety division, also known as the Fire Marshal's Office. Talk about partnering with other agencies for training, improving health and wellness programs for emergency services employees, enriching the capabilities of our communications center, and enhancing the capabilities of the emergency management function within the city. So jumping right into goal number 5, continue the improvements to emergency services response system. And sorry, I gotta get the right page up on my screen here. In there, basically, it talks about a recommendation that we monitor the incremental improvements to the emergency medical response system. So earlier in the plan, we talked about the addition of basic life support system, or BLS cars. We talked about some changes in looking at either an embedded nurse in the dispatch center or a nursing type hotline. And this recommendation kind of goes along with making sure that once we get some of those initiatives going, and the community paramedic was the other one. And once we get some of those initiatives going, we want to monitor what those improvements make to the overall of the system, so that we make sure that we're watching how those things affect the overall growth of call volume. The next recommendation there is monitor the growth in the northern sections of Fire District 8 for increased population or commercial development. And when we talk about that, when we talk about those northern sections of Fire District 8, we're talking about those areas in the urban growth area, particularly when we look out like the north end of Cordata and into out in the areas going out Pacific Highway towards Slater Road and the areas up around the airport, that we need to continue to look and monitor the growth that is happening out of there. And that's one area that, as we start to annex as a city, is going to be an area that we're going to need to start looking at. How do we provide timely fire and EMS services out to those areas? Then a recommendation to monitor increases to call volume for additional resources, or for the addition of resources. And this is, it seems like a very simple goal: monitor increases to call volume and look at when we need to add additional resources. But this is one that we've fallen quite a ways behind. If you look through our plan, when it talks about the needs of those additional resources, the BLS cars, the community paramedic, the changes in dispatch, all of those identified a short timeline that needed for implementation within the plan. And that's relevant to the fact that we were far behind where we needed to be, or continue to be far behind where we needed to be in our overall number of units out here in the community. And so this is just kind of almost a reminder as we go forward. Once we make the changes that we talk about here within the strategic plan, that we need to spend more time looking forward and planning ahead, as opposed to continually trying to play catch up as we grow. You can pretty much drive all around the city here at any time right now and see how we continue to grow, not just outward, but infill, and what that does to our call volume and the increased workload on our units. And this recommendation is just a reminder to us that needs to be part of our ongoing planning process, is that we're looking at how, whether we're talking about infill or whether we're talking about growing out into the UGA, that we need to be more cognizant of how that affects our overall responsiveness. Our next goal here, improve the capability of our life safety division. So currently we have 3 inspectors, the fire marshal, and a permit technician that all work in our life safety division. Ideally, our life safety division handles a lot of the fire reviews for new construction permits, but should also be engaged in ongoing inspections of existing facilities, as well as ongoing inspections of businesses that have different hazardous processes. Right now, our
life safety staff is engaged, about 83% of their time is engaged in nothing but the permitting process. And so that leaves very little time for them to get out and get into inspecting existing buildings for ongoing hazards such as blocked entrances or exits. And it also does not allow for us to achieve all the inspections that we'd like to see for those businesses that are doing different hazardous operations. Think of hazardous chemical storage or processing that involves the use of hazardous chemicals. So the recommendation was to add an additional fire inspector. The next goal in here was to partner with Whatcom County Fire District 4 to enhance the training facility. And that was the overall goal, but there's some kind of deeper recommendations here, which first one was to create a partnership. And actually at our last meeting, we did approve the interlocal with Fire District 4, or actually I think it was 2 meetings ago now. We approved an interlocal with Fire District 4 for the use of their training facility. So we now have an ongoing agreement with them to be able to use that. Bellingham does not have a training facility of our own anywhere within the city. Instead, we contracted with District 4 to use the one out on Britton Loop Road, just outside of the city. And literally as of the last annexation, across the street from the city. So we have that interlocal in place for using their training facility. The next recommendation in there was to create a regional training consortium. So we have been working on this kind of on an ad hoc basis. Bellingham, South Whatcom Fire Authority, and North Whatcom Fire and Rescue have been working cooperatively on probably about half of our training, half of our hands-on training that we do involves using crews from all of those districts working together. And so we've been doing that kind of on a very loose ad hoc type basis. We have had discussions with those agencies about trying to formalize that and trying to create basically a joint training division that would put together training for all of the organizations together. We're still working through trying to figure out how to staff and support that to meet the needs of all the different organizations, but we're hopeful that we'll be able to bring something forward on that here in the future. And then the last piece there is support the expansion of the training facility. So while the Britton Loop training facility is the best training facility in Whatcom County, it's also the only fire training facility in Whatcom County. It was very much, it's a small tower and drill grounds there with essentially one room that they can do live fire training in. And so it doesn't quite meet all of our training needs. In fact, recently we sent our Career Recruit Academy down to a different training facility in Snohomish County to achieve some of the live fire needs for training. So we need to look at how maybe we can work together with District 4 to expand that facility to meet our needs and the needs of the fire service here in the county into the future. Goal number 8, improve the health and wellness programs for emergency services employees. And in here, they recommend working with other emergency service agencies to develop a regional approach and review programs available that are specifically for emergency services personnel. And of course, safety is one of the paramount tenets here within the fire department. We do a lot of training around trying to make a very unsafe job as safe as we possibly can. But as we've learned over time, a lot of the dangers that we face are not necessarily those involved with hostile fire type environments, or working on the roadside, on the freeway. Those aren't necessarily some of our biggest safety concerns. A lot of, when we look at firefighter deaths and injury around the country, a lot of that comes from internal wellness related to cardiac health. And then the other big one is cancer prevention. When we look at the byproducts of fire and the byproducts of diesel engines being used and stored inside of buildings, that's a big part of what contributes to the overall health issues for firefighters. So as part of this, our health and wellness chief, who's our training chief, Ryan Provinger, he has been working along with the police department, and they engaged a group out of California, and I'm sorry, I forget the actual college they're involved with right now, but they engaged a group out of California that are looking at a pilot program, and we actually have 6 employees from the fire department and 6 from the police department that are engaged in this program that identifies various health, wellness, mindfulness, stress release, and other items that they go through in this pilot program, where they look at whether it's exercise or eating properly, or again, different techniques for managing stress. And so we're looking at this pilot program right now, and have, again, 12 members from both police and fire department going through that, and look forward to seeing what results that yields and what it might look like in the future for the rest of the fire and police employees. Goal number 9, enrich the capabilities of our communications center. And this was mainly related to how we deal with supervision and handle some lead duties within the dispatch center. The consultants recommended that we establish a lead dispatcher position on each shift. Previously, we just had a single supervisor who worked 40 hours a week, but is trying to manage the supervision of folks working 24/7. So we created a lead that's not a supervisor, but somebody on the shift who can be kind of a resource for the other people on the shift, and be the go-to person to handle some of the needs that we have that pop up 24 hours a day. In our last contract with the local 114F, we were able to establish a program in their contract for lead dispatcher. And then we have since, in the consultant's recommendation was to hire or promote the necessary individuals. The way that things are structured within the contract, we appoint an individual each time they do a shift rotation and identify somebody to be in that lead position. So we've accomplished these goals already. Goal number 10 was to enhance the capabilities of our emergency management function. And their recommendation was to establish an emergency management planner position. Again, we completed that with the mid-biennium adjustments back at the beginning of 2020. And then the other recommendation was to hire, promote the necessary individuals for the position. In there, I say that we completed that in February of 2020, because we filled it. And then we had a vacancy occur, and the person filling that actually promoted into our emergency manager position. So that spot is vacant at the moment, but back in the queue to be refilled here shortly. So we've managed to complete that goal for the plan. So those were the last set of goals there within the plan from the consultants. And I'll pop back out to the wide screen here and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Chief Hewitt. I'll turn to Councilmember Anderson first.
Thank you very much. And thank you again for the third installment of this presentation. It was a lot to read, and you and I have had discussions on some of the components, which I really appreciated. In the past, there was a comment you made, and I don't know if it's, I just happened to forget the date, so hopefully you could refresh my memory. Under the goal number 8, to improve the health and wellness of the programs, I think that is such a critical goal, because we really do want the health and safety and the long-term health of our employees to be first and foremost. But the example of the running diesel engines inside the stations, I know at a certain point that was done, and then there was a point of time when the realization was that's not very good for the long-term health and impacts of our employees. And so new exhaust capturing systems were put in place. Do you remember the date those were done? And then could you also let me know if after that was decided that needed to be the standard, are all stations now fitted with that? Or were there any stations that were renovated and built that didn't have that exhaust capture put in place? I obviously have a concern about the diesel exhaust smoke and the correlation of health impacts. And so it would be good to be updated whether or not that very much needed safety component has been retrofitted in all of our stations. And if not, when will it be?
Yes, it has. Currently all 7 of the Bellingham facilities that house apparatus have them, and then the 2 District 8 stations where we have apparatus and housing in the same building also have them in them. We have 1 storage building for District 8 that doesn't have that in the building, but it's also just a storage building. There's nobody works in that facility. The Bellingham stations were outfitted with exhaust systems back in the mid 2000s. I don't know the exact year. And then Fire District 8 stations were retrofitted here in, I want to say 2018 was when we were able to get those stations updated with a system in them. So, and that is the standard. When we talk about these things, though, they're all of these things, when we talk about wellness, we've learned a lot over the years about firefighting cancer and the cancers related to that. It wasn't that long ago that it was very normal for firefighters to keep their firefighting bunker gear in their bedroom with them right next to their bunk. So when they got a call in the middle of the night, they could jump in and put those on and run out to the rig. Well, now we know that our bunker gear actually carries those carcinogens everywhere we take it. And so we've done a lot over the years to improve, our ability to wash and clean bunker gear, our ability to have 2 sets so we can immediately be available to go back out again if we have a set in the wash. We've done a lot of improvements. Even though District 8 didn't have the exhaust removal systems in their stations until more recently, part of that, they had special filters added aftermarket to their exhaust to help filter out the carcinogens that come out of the diesel exhaust. So we've put a lot of work on it, but it's not to say that there's not a lot more out there left for us to look at.
I'm just going to jump in real quick. So I apologize to Councilmember Hamill, whose hand is up, because I want to follow through on timely. the bunker gear that I talked with, I think some folks at Station 5, because I had questioned why everything was outside, and they had talked me through why. And I found it interesting that, people used to transport their own gear in their personal vehicle if they were at Station 3 and then they were filling in at Station 5. And there's now protocols on how to transfer that in order to lessen contamination of some of those cancer-causing materials. Could you speak to that a little bit? Because that their bunker gear is essential for their safety, but it also can carry a lot of carcinogens, that level of exposure. So is there anything coming through better materials or some processes in order to help mitigate that level of exposure? Because anything we can do to lessen the potential of cancer amongst our firefighter personnel, I think is a priority for us. So I'm just kind of curious how that's handled when they're working at different stations.
The main thing is we've achieved kind of the industry standard there, and the fact that we do have 2 different sets, and that after every call, basically every call that where they engage in any kind of firefighting activity, they're bringing their bunker gear back and they're washing it, so that we're only dealing with clean gear going forward. And that's been the biggest innovation, is the fact that we have washers and drying rooms in all 6 of the Bellingham stations. And after every call, they're washing that gear, and then they have that second set of gear that's clean, ready to go, so that they can still respond to the next alarm. So that's probably the biggest thing that we can do in that arena, is just to continue that program of maintaining the 2 sets of bunker gear and having facilities readily available for the cleaning of gear.
Councilmember Hamel.
Yeah, I just briefly wanted to express support if the direction to go towards incremental improvements in medical response ends up being a nurse line. I'm definitely supportive of that for low acuity calls. But my question is around growth. It's the second bullet point in item 5 about monitoring the growth in the northern sections of Fire District 8. I'm trying to recall annexation phasing plan statutory obligations for fire urban levels of service provision for fire as we grow outward. What is the trigger on that? What is the situation where we would need to think about building a new fire station or staffing up?
I don't know that there's a clear line of statutory requirement, and I'm glad to see Rick pop online here because he can help bail me out. But I don't believe that there's a clear hard line as far as statutory requirements. But it's more as we look forward, and in the plan, there's various different maps and stuff that talk about our 4-minute travel time expectations and the expectation for full firefighting force to arrive on scene. Those are some of the things that we need to start looking at. The other big piece of that too is the call volume, and that so Station 6, which serves out in that Cordata neighborhood, has rapidly become our second busiest fire station here. I mean, last month they passed Station 3, which is Billy Frank Jr. Street, has always been our busiest station for as long as I've been in the fire service. Station 1, because it's in the center of town and serves as backup to a lot of the other stations, has always been a close second. But recently, Station 6 took over the second place spot with just the pure growth that's going on out at Cordata. So, Rick, you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, just a couple of things. For District 8, we're already serving that area, and bringing it in wouldn't be a profound change, some change because of the degree of staffing of the stations. I do think if we consider greenfield development, that will be a change in the future, especially as we look to the north. Greenfield, however, doesn't have demands the minute it comes in. So we'd probably be looking to address capital facilities as we figure out the build out will likely be on that. And that'll be part of any annexation study is we'll figure out how long will it take till this matures that will warrant that kind of level of service. So just bringing land in doesn't cue it. It cues our ability to plan for it. And then we want to have it ready pretty much in time when we get there.
Thank you, Director Sepler. Does anyone else have any questions before I go back to Councilmember Anderson? No? Okay, Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you very much. So as far as budget priorities, I mean, all these goals are great to achieve, and I'm thinking of next steps going forward. If we were to try to prioritize what would be considered most essential, I know gearing up for staff, retirement, training, those are all essential, but I personally would almost think the dedicated transport may be the next big ask, or would you consider that, you know, we need the nursing in dispatch? I'm just thinking that, you know, the thought that to take essential fire services from one station out of commission to transport someone to the hospital just doesn't seem to be the wisest use of resources, given that if there was a fire or something more critical, then somebody from another station would have to respond, which could delay the time. I'm just kind of wondering if I gave you a budget that said, we're going to give you one thing in the next year, and you had to prioritize what you think would be the most essential step. I'm kind of curious what you would feel would be that item.
Yeah, definitely the BLS transport unit is the number one issue. We've got multiple stations that are running more calls than what, as we mentioned before, than what survey and rating recommends for a single company station. So number one is going to be to add an additional response unit out onto the street. I will caution that we are still, as Councilmember Hamill has brought up a couple times in other parts of the meeting today, we are also still very much watching what the effects of some of the legislation related to police response for mental health that could quickly eclipse the BLS car as the most urgent need, but that need's also going to be a lot smaller need to start with. But both of those are directly related to us handling the emergencies in front of us today, where a lot of this other stuff is more about building capacity for the future.
Thank you very much.
Other questions or comments from council? Okay. Seeing none, thank you very much, Chief Hewitt. We appreciate you bringing this report forward, and certainly if there are follow-up questions, it's an ongoing process just to review and implementing strategic plans, and so we expect we'll keep in touch. But thank you very much for spending three meetings with us reviewing this in detail, so it is appreciated.
No, I appreciate your time, and if anybody does have any questions in the future, feel free to shoot me an email and we'll be happy to get you some additional information.
Great. Thank you, Chief Hewitt. So our last item before Committee of the Whole this afternoon is Agenda Bill 22953. This is a review of an ordinance of the City of Bellingham, Washington relating to employment in Bellingham, establishing labor standard requirements for additional compensation for certain grocery employees working in Bellingham. So the City Council will review the underlying ordinance and discuss the metrics and other factors that will be used to identify the appropriate time to end the requirements for additional compensation for certain grocery employees working in Bellingham, otherwise known as hazard pay. And so at this time, the purpose of this agenda bill was in light of ongoing discussions and continuing changes in the pandemic and vaccination rates and other data is to come forward so that we're all clear on sort of outlining and acknowledging what the metrics are that we're looking at for ourselves in the city, as well as the workers who obviously are most directly impacted. And so to start off, I don't know, City Attorney Mariner, if you had anything that you wanted to say.
I just have a brief comment is that there are two ways to end the hazard pay. It's in the ordinance. It's one, this council can repeal the ordinance. And the other way that the hazard pay would stop is if Mayor Fleetwood ended his proclamation of a local emergency. So this council certainly has the authority to repeal the ordinance at the time it sees fit.
And so speaking to that point, Mayor Fleetwood, do you have a sense, obviously things are still in flux to say the least, but whether locally we're looking to follow, guidance from the governor's office, or if there are other specific metrics or things that you're looking at specifically with respect to the proclamation of emergency that we're currently under, and when that would be taken away?
Yeah, at this point, we're waiting until the 1st of July, and we're anticipating that there's going to be information from which we can adduce where the governor's at with the governor's emergency proclamation. I can imagine that the information that they provide as it relates to metrics will be very informative and will have bearing on what municipalities are doing across the state. So I will say, just sort of anecdotally, one hears lots of people with whom I'm in meetings discuss the fact that it's coming. I don't think we're prepared to declare when that's going to be, but conceivably in the next few months, if things continue as they are, perhaps sooner. I suspect I'll be able to provide you a much more informative answer on that question at the next council meeting, the first meeting in July, because I believe we'll have had more information by that time.
Thank you, Mayor Fleetwood. And any specific questions or weigh in from council members? I know that there had been some discussion about looking at that further. Councilmember Lillquist.
Thank you for bringing this forward. I kind of noted this when we passed it, is that we were creating a challenge for ourselves, which is to make kind of a public health decision, though we're not public health officials. And so I really want to turn towards whoever we can to public health officials for guidance on this decision. Health Director Lautenbach will be here tonight. I hope to ask her a few questions. But it's hard to know what to think. I mean, President Biden says the country will be open on July 4th, Independence Day. The CDC, state level officials, they're removing mask restrictions or revising recommendations. I'm still wearing a mask, but if I were to go into the store and both customers and the workers aren't wearing masks, it's hard to feel like that's a hazardous situation anymore. So this will need to come to an end. At the minimum, if we don't come up with a time to start phasing it out now and give people warning, I'd ask that we put it back on our agenda for July 5th, because that would be our next meeting. We should at least have it available.
Just for clarification, Councilmember Lillquist, just for clarification, our next meeting will be July 12th, because we will not meet on the 5th due to the holiday.
I'm sorry. Well, all the more important. July 12th. Yeah, if we can't reach a decision today, we should at least have it be a kind of a rolling discussion.
And City Attorney Mariner, if I can just ask so indicated that in the ordinance, either repeal of the ordinance or when the mayor ends the proclamation, I read it as if it was repealed before the emergency was lifted, but is it either or, in that if the emergency was lifted and the council chose to extend that? Is it?
Well, I think either one of those actions will stop the hazard pay.
Right. And so if we don't repeal it before the mayor ends the proclamation of emergency, then it would automatically end effective that date.
Correct.
Okay. Councilmember Knudsen.
I'm not going to say too much. I was in the minority on this, and I still believe that. But, when you go into a grocery store now, it says if you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask. There's a lot of people in the stores now. They're not wearing masks. I've gone to several restaurants in town. I won't name any restaurants. The staff doesn't even have masks. People aren't even have masks. So all I'm saying is whether the governor ends this on June 30th or July 1st or whenever, people are gone past go several times now are collecting their chips because a lot of things out there are happening and a lot of people are doing things that they weren't doing before. So I think it's ending on its own. And the more that, I don't know, I'm just not going to say any more on it. I know how everybody else feels about it and that's fine. But I just think saying now that they need hazard pay just doesn't cut mustard anymore because Friday morning when I went in to buy donuts at one of the grocery stores, there was hardly anybody in there with a mask on. So that's all I'm going to say. And then I ate something very unhealthy like a donut. So I'm done.
So just for transparency and clarity, because we don't meet again until the 12th, Mayor Fleetwood, I guess if we're saying we could receive additional direction the end of June 30th, is that ending the proclamation of emergency? That's something that could happen at any time. Obviously, it's not dependent upon a council meeting or a council action. And so presumably that could happen at any time. I'm just wanting to be clear about just process and how that could come about. And so
your question is, could it happen at any time?
I'm just confirming that, yeah, it's not that it would come before council for any other, vote or action. And so just making sure that the public as well as workers and those impacted are aware that of the ordinance and, how it could end, and the fact that since we don't meet again until the 12th, if something was to happen in that interim, it could potentially end sooner.
I don't anticipate it happening before July 12th. What I can tell you is that, and yeah, I'm empowered to end the proclamation with a signature, but it's going to be done in a very well-considered, well-vetted way, talking to local health officials, having conversations with staff. I imagine that there'll be some conversations in our bi-monthly mayor's meetings. There's going to be a lot of input that's going to go into the criteria that we should be appropriately using to justify ending it. But I do think there's going to be a ramp up sooner rather than later on those conversations. Of course, I'll share with the council what we do and our reasoning. But again, it's my personal assumption that it wouldn't happen before July 12th.
Thank you for that, Mayor Fleetwood. Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you very much. Being the counselor who brought this forward, obviously, I'm pretty passionate about it and have done a lot of research and continue to do so. I've been fully vaccinated, my family has, and we still wear masks because of the concern for breakthrough cases. There's a new variant which has just really started to roll out through the United States. It's hit Washington, but not Whatcom County, and that's the Delta. And when we're looking at our numbers, we haven't hit the 70% yet vaccination for people with one shot. We're barely over 50% for people fully vaccinated. And with this new variant, if you're fully vaccinated, you are only 88% protected. If you've only had one of the two shots and you're not fully vaccinated, the data is looking at 33% covered. So there's still a lot of unknowns, and I am not for ending this quickly just because there's one number coming out from the health department that says we're close to 70. I would personally like to know what some of our what our numbers are for our BIPOC community members, because data has shown that they have been known to get sicker or hospitalized. just a week ago, we were up into the 20s being hospitalized, and now that's dropped. But next week, are we going to see the Delta in our community and people who have only had one shot end up getting it? So, and just to kind of answer a little bit, when I go shopping, I'm seeing a mixed bag, but we also know there are anti-maskers and anti-vaxxer people who, personally, I don't trust that everybody walking around without a mask has actually been fully vaccinated. I think some people have, but I think some people aren't, and they're just at liberty because there's not enforcement or having to show evidence or proof. So I think we're getting closer. I don't see this going to the point of, waiting until September to be reviewed or extended, but I just don't want to do something quickly without really good evidence and verification that we're there. And again, if for some reason, if Mayor Fleetwood on, July 2nd decided based on what the state said, that if the state declared that the emergency declaration is over and they withdraw it, I can't imagine that we would necessarily continue it at length at the municipality level. But if for some reason, it's good to hear that Mayor Fleetwood said that it's going to be well thought out and sequenced. But the day, if he should decide before we do as a body that if he declares the emergency order is over, then the ordinance ends. There, we don't have to meet. We're not discussing it. It was written so that that could be a trigger point. So just sharing a few words.
Thank you, Councilmember Anderson. Chief Hewitt.
Yeah, just speaking from the Office of Emergency Management, as we watch what's happening both at the state and local level, we're talking about dialing back on certain restrictions or activities. The emergency is far from ending. Conditions are changing, obviously, but that do allow us to reduce some of those restrictions. But right now, through Whatcom Unified Command, the city, the county, and specifically county health, we're meeting quite regularly to talk about how those things are impacted. But I can tell you from those discussions, we're still a long ways from the end of the emergency. That emergency declaration, not only is it tied to the ability to implement some of these emergency restrictions, but it's also gets tied into some of the funding that we are able to receive through FEMA and the other federal agencies. So right now I can tell you, certainly there's, I don't see an end to an emergency anytime before the July 12th meeting. And I honestly don't really see an ending to the emergency declaration until somewhere later into the fall. So, and again, tonight we'll probably be able to get some more information from Director Lautenbach, but just purely from an emergency management perspective, we've got a ways to go.
Thank you, Chief Hewitt. That's helpful. And I don't know if council members had any other questions or things they wanted to share or discuss. Mostly I just wanted, since there'd been ongoing discussions and questions from constituents as well as council members, just for transparency's sake, to say it again. I know in legal and Councilmember Anderson obviously worked hard on this, saying it's very clear in the ordinance what happens. Sometimes those details get lost in the shuffle. And so just wanting to come back before the public and have that even brief discussion. So I appreciate everybody's time. Anything further? Okay. So seeing none, we will move forward with, at this point, we have a set of minutes for approval. This is from our last meeting on June 7th, the committee meeting minutes.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion's been made by Councilmember Knutson and a second by Councilmember Hamel. Any discussion or corrections? Seeing none, all in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed or abstentions? Seeing none, that passes 7-0. Old and new business. Okay. We will have, I know, we will have another old and new business this afternoon. I actually have a couple of older new items, but I was going to reserve those for the evening session just because we have a lengthy executive session this afternoon. And so to make sure we get everything in before our meeting this evening. So at this point, we will move to executive session, and we have 3 items before us this afternoon. And just a reminder to council members that that invite for the executive session was sent out by email. So 3 items before us. The first and second are both potential property acquisitions that will be handled by Mariner for approximately 15 minutes each. And the third is litigation, Lev versus City of Bellingham et al. That'll be Mariner for approximately 60 minutes. So if nothing further, we will adjourn and reconvene this evening at 7 p.m. Thank you all very much.